Well, hey, 545 enrollees. This poor old dog is trying to learn some new tricks here, and I have a lot of hope that I can pull this off. This is actually a lecture that I gave the Friday before break, and actually one of the only benefits of this entire fiasco is that I'm going to be able to finish this lecture, whereas I did not in class before. But hopefully this will work, and we'll fine tune the process as we go along. Let's start. Let me remind you of what we've been talking about, what we were talking about before the break, and that's the cerebellum. And this slide, remember, is my big summary of motor stuff in the course. And the role of the cerebellum, you can see there at the top, is to influence upper motor neuron pathways. And if you cling to that, that's really going to help you in figuring out what the job of the cerebellum is, what the different roles of the different parts are. And speaking of different parts, point as we introduce the cerebellum, and that is that although it's all about coordination, ultimately it's actually going to be three different uh, distinctions, three different things that the cerebellum does. And there's a lot of ways to say this. When most people think of coordination, what they're actually thinking of is that first thing, where when movements are in progress, they seem to be modulated correctly. And that's not by accident. That's a significant role of one part of the cerebellum, to be monitoring what's going on in the periphery and making adjustments to movements as they're in progress. The second thing is it's going to work very closely with the vestibular system to help the vestibular system's reflexes that involve adjusting posture in order to maintain a nice stable base for the body to balance on, and also to adjust eye movements, although that's not explicitly said in this bullet. And the third thing has to do with what human beings especially do particularly well, and that is very complicated movements, movements with a lot of elements that have to be well timed. And the cerebellum is going to be involved at the very initial stages of those movements with the planning and timing. All of these different aspects of coordination are roles of the cerebellum that are accomplished through the cerebellum's influence on upper motor neuron pathways. And therefore, your knowledge of those upper motor neuron pathways is absolutely critical to understanding the circuits, the ins and outs of the cerebellum. I left off after the first of the two cerebellar lectures. This is the slide we were talking about. And this is the slide I was going to use as my starting point for the second lecture, because it gives us kind of a point to envision what's going on in the cortex, and to that apply the circuit that's going to come up here over and over again. There's a lot of information on this slide. I'm trying to show you the elements, the cellular elements, the neuronal elements of the cerebellum that are important to us. Input, the vast majority of the input comes through those mossy fibers, which are excitatory, and that's the things like proprioception that we talked about, vestibular sense, and information from the cortex, all that good stuff coming into the cerebellum. That's the majority of the input, and that's arriving via the inferior and middle cerebellar peduncles. And the target of those mossy fibers is the granule cell layer, this densely populated neuronal layer in the cerebellar cortex, which has all these little granule cells. They're excitatory, and their axons leave that layer and go up to the very superficial parts of the cortex, the so-called molecular layer, where the axons then spread in a very distinctive parallel pattern up and down the folium. That synapse, the many synapses that they make with Purkinje cells are excitatory. And the Purkinje cells in the single monolayer of cells um, have their dendrites up there in that molecular layer, and they are the output from the cortex. Purkinje cells have axons that project back out of the cortex into the deep parts of the cerebellum, and although there are some exceptions, the vast majority of these guys are projecting to the deep cerebellar nuclei, and these are the ones that are embedded in the white matter of the cerebellum. The Purkinje cells are always inhibitory, and although there's all sorts of neat cellular reasons that you would want to consider that. Let's keep our life simple and recognize that overall, the cerebellum's job is actually to remove excessive and inaccurate movements from the motor plan. And so that's fitting that the Purkinje cells would therefore be inhibitory. Although there are other things that distinguish it, cerebellar disease is often characterized by crude and exaggerated movements. The deep cerebellar nuclei, that's going to be fastigial closest to midline, then interposed, and then that big dentate nucleus that looks so strikingly like the inferior olive. The deep cerebellar nuclei are the neurons, contain the neurons whose axons then project to the various upper motor neuron pathways. So here is the basic pattern. I've got some sort of afferent information that's coming via these mossy fibers, coming into the cerebellum and projecting to one or another parts of the cerebellar cortex. And the cerebellar cortex, via its Purkinje cells, then projects out to one of the deep cerebellar nuclei. And those projections are inhibitory. These are GABAergic neurons. Now, the deep cerebellar nuclei, like neurons all over the nervous system, have some sort of background activity, and the influence of the Purkinje cells decreases that activity. The neurons in the deep cerebellar nuclei, these are the guys who are projecting out of the cerebellum, and the vast majority of those are in the superior cerebellar peduncle, projecting to one or another of the upper motor neuron tracts. And once again, when you review your upper motor neuron tracts, you'll realize that you know where those deep cerebellar nuclei are projecting. They're going to the places those upper motor neuron tracts originate, whether that is motor cortex or one of the many nuclei in the brainstem. Now, these three divisions of the cerebellum, three functional divisions, are going to correspond to those three functions that are on that earlier slide. These three parts of the cerebellum are distinct from one another in that they are going to be responsible each for one of those three things, whether it's complex movements and its timing, whether it's coordinating vestibular reflexes and the control of posture and eye movements, or if it's to monitor and adjust movements that are in progress to make them more accurate. And there's a corollary of this, and that is that if it's going to have different functions, each of those divisions therefore has to have a different set of inputs, the afferents, and outputs, the efferents. The information needed to do the job is going to be different for each of those functions. And the information that comes out of the cerebellum has to influence different upper motor neuron pathways. We're going to name each of these functional divisions according to the source of the afferents. It turns out there are a couple of different systems for naming cerebellar divisions, and I'm going to stick to this one because it makes so much sense. We're going to start with what is called vestibulocerebellum, and already you know something about this based on its name. You know that it's going to get information from the vestibular system. Now, I know we haven't talked about the vestibular system yet. That's coming in a few weeks, but this is the part of the cerebellum that's interested in coordinating and regulating vestibular reflexes that influence stable posture and stable eye movements. Anatomically, this is the only one of the functional divisions that directly corresponds to a specific lobe of the cerebellum, and that's the flocculonodular lobe. Remember, the nodulus is that little portion of the vermis right there on the part facing the fourth ventricle, and it's actually connected. It's hard to see on a picture like this. It's connected to these two little flocculi that stick out to the sides there. That's the flocculonodular lobe, and that is anatomically what we're going to call functionally the vestibulocerebellum. Its job, as you see in this bullet, is to use information from the vestibular system to coordinate the proximal muscles, the muscles that are most concerned with posture, and to coordinate eye movements. Well, with that in mind, I've of course said multiple times now, the input is from the vestibular system. It's mostly from the nuclei, as it should be. This is a very old system, and so there are some primary afferents that come directly from the periphery and go all the way into the cerebellum, but please don't fret about that. That's not a big deal. As far as coming out, you guys know that the cortex has to project via one of the deep cerebellar nuclei. And when it comes to all of these nuclei, when you think axial muscles, when you think postural muscles, the muscles of the trunk and the proximal limbs, you should be thinking of the fastigial nucleus in the cerebellum. That's the one that's closest to midline. And that's actually a really nice, simple mnemonic, right? When you think midline, you're thinking postural muscles, you're thinking the trunk. And it turns out that the deep cerebellar nucleus closest to midline is the one that's going to be concerned with this. The targets have got to be upper motor neuron pathways that influence those muscles in the proximal part of the limbs and in the trunk. And you guys know from your study of upper motor neuron systems that what we're talking about here are the medial motor systems. And specifically, we're going to concentrate on the two vestibulospinal tracts and the two reticulospinal tracts. And since those are the pathways that it's influencing, these are the nuclei the vestibulocerebellum has to talk to, the vestibular nuclei and the reticular nuclei. So here again is that simple little circuit, afferent information in, going to cerebellar cortex, going out through a deep cerebellar nucleus to influence output to upper motor neuron tracts. This is always going to be the template for all these circuits I'm about to show you. Now, if we start plugging in the specifics, what we find is that the vestibular system, a few directly from the apparatus in the inner ear, but mostly from the vestibular nuclei, is going to project to the cerebellar cortex. And of course, specifically, we're talking about the flocculonodular lobe. And the Purkinje neurons of the flocculonodular lobe are going to project with their inhibitory axons to the deep cerebellar nuclei, and specifically for these medial motor systems, that will be the fastigial nucleus. Now, the fastigial nucleus is going to influence upper motor neuron tracts, and it's going to accomplish this by influencing the vestibular nuclei and the reticular nuclei, both of which give rise to tracts of the medial motor systems, and specifically those two medial and lateral vestibulospinal and medial and lateral reticulospinal tracts. Now, this is an important notion here because I'm going to circle back around to this when we talk about clinical findings. But the effects, the activity in the cerebellum is mostly an ipsilateral process. In other words, one side of the cerebellum is influencing the coordination on the ipsilateral side of the body. Now, you don't have to think about this very long to realize that these upper motor neuron pathways we're talking about here, some of them are bilaterally distributed. And therefore, there are some bilateral effects in this particular portion of the cerebellum, but it is mostly ipsilateral. And I want you to cling to that because that's the important notion. This was the second of the three functional divisions of the cerebellum we talked about. And this is cerebrocerebellum. And again, the name tells you something about what's going to go on here, what part of the nervous system is sending information to this part of the cerebellum. Anatomically speaking, this doesn't correlate to any of the specific lobes. It is most of the lateral hemispheres are involved in this. You can see in my overlay here, I've left a blank area on the cerebellum adjacent to the vermis. That blue area, this is the cerebrocerebellum. This part of the cerebellum is most specifically concerned with the planning and timing and initiation of complex movements. And by complex, remember what we're talking about. We're talking about the very elaborate movements of human hands and the vocal apparatus, those things in particular. We could expand that a little bit and imagine other movements that are pretty complicated in all the different muscles that have to be activated. The input comes from the cerebrum, obviously, and this is going to be a place where I'd like you to use some logic here. If you're concerned about planning and timing and initiation, you need to be talking to the motor areas of the cortex, and that's going to be primarily areas 4, that's of course the primary motor cortex, and 6, which is part of the premotor and supplementary motor areas. And when I say via Ponte nuclei, it's because we're going to have to do a little bit of relaying along because of some laterality issues. And I do have a little nod to the fact that, yeah, it turns out nothing is nearly as simple as you think. There are a lot of other cortical areas that influence, but you know what? Let's keep our life simple. We'll call it 4 and 6. As far as output goes, when you think complicated fractionated movements of the hands, you should be thinking of the lateral motor systems. And now here's another place where we can just kind of fall back on what seems pretty obvious, and that is that the cerebellar nucleus that's concerned with these lateral motor systems is the one that's most lateral, and that's that big old dentate nucleus. The ultimate target of the neurons in the cerebellar nucleus, in this case the dentate, are those cortical areas that are most specifically concerned with initiation of complex movements in the lateral motor systems, and that's going to be areas 4 and 6 again. Now you guys know that nothing gets to the cortex without going through the thalamus, and so specifically now we're going to call on VA and VL, which were thalamic relay nuclei we talked about at the beginning of, well, whenever we did thalamus. And I'm going to make a little quick note of red nucleus now, and we're going to show how that fits in. You guys know there's not really much of a rubrospinal tract in human beings. So here's that basic pattern again. Information into cortex, out through one of the deep cerebellar nuclei, back to upper motor neuron pathways. Okay, here we go. We're going to put the circuit in place with the particulars. We're going to start up in the cerebral cortex and project to the cerebellar cortex. But we're going to actually put a relay in here in the pons in what are called pontine nuclei. If you look in your Haynes atlas, you'll see that there are a bunch of fairly nondescript nuclei spread through the base of the pons. And it's these pontine nuclei that give rise to the transverse fibers of the pons that we have long in this course used as identifiers for the pons itself. They're what make it characteristically the way it is. The transverse fibers create the great big middle cerebellar peduncles. And those axons then go up to the cortex of the lateral hemispheres. It's processed in that mysterious way that the cerebellum does to come back out as Purkinje cell axons and inhibit one of the deep cerebellar nuclei. And for these lateral motor systems, that's going to be the dentate nucleus. The dentate then projects back to the cortex to influence the planning and timing and initiation of those movements. But of course, nothing gets to the cortex what it doesn't go through thalamus, and that means we need some thalamic relay, and that's going to be VAVL. By the way, the projections out of the cortex to the pontine nuclei and from the thalamus back to the cortex are finally the axons that we find in the anterior limb of the internal capsule. This pathway crosses midline twice. And this ends up making sense because we want the cerebellum to influence movement on the same side of the body. We want the right side of the cerebellum to influence movement on the right side of the body. If you think about what that means in terms of this diagram, if the left area 4, the left primary motor cortex, is going to initiate movement, you know, because the lateral corticospinal tract is a cross pathway, that the left primary motor cortex influences movement on the right side of the body. That means that the left cortex talks to the right cerebellar hemisphere, and the right cerebellar hemisphere has to feed back to the left cortex. It has to cross midline twice so that the right side of the cerebellum influences movement on the right side of the body. You may want to think through that and talk yourself through it a couple times to see how that works. I'm not sure I'm explaining it very well. One other thing I need to add to this pathway, and that is that this is all about influencing activity in the lateral motor systems. And if you spend some time looking back at your upper motor neuron pathways, you'll remember that in addition to the great big, very important, very dominant lateral corticospinal tract, the lateral motor systems also include the small rubrospinal tract. Rubrospinal may not even really exist in human beings. That said, if it did, if the rubrospinal tract were an important part of fractionated movement, you would expect to see this. You would expect to see the dentate nucleus also projecting to the red nucleus and theoretically influencing the rubrospinal tract. Well, I'm going to tell you right now that's not its role. It does project to the red nucleus, but it's not to influence what may not even exist, the rubrispinal tract. The red nucleus certainly is there, and that is because it's populated mainly not by the big magnocellular neurons that give rise to rubrispinal tract, but rather by many smaller neurons, which are called parvocellular. Parvo means small, actually. And although what I'm about to show you is very well understood by many, many people, I'm just going to ask you to know something super simple because I only know it in a simple way. The role of the red nucleus in human beings is not to give rise to the rubrispinal tract. It is to use information coming from cerebellum in motor learning. What I just drew in here, this dotted line, is the motor learning pathway. Projections from the red nucleus come back via the inferior olivary nucleus and feed back up into the lateral hemispheres of the cerebellum. Activity as you are rehearsing complicated movements, activity in this circuit is actually the underpinnings of what we're going to learn to call motor learning in this course. The last of the functional divisions I've saved for last because it's seemingly more complex. But if you do this, if you fall back on what you understand about the role of the cerebellum, the circuit isn't going to seem that crazy to you. This part of the cerebellum is called the spinocerebellum because it receives most of its input from the spinal cords, from the spinal cord. Anatomically speaking, the spinocerebellum consists of the rest of the vermis, the rest being everything but the nodulus, which is part of the flocculonodular lobe, and these regions of the lateral hemispheres adjacent to the vermis, which we can call paravermal. That's anatomically what the spinocerebellum. As far as what we're going to do with this, the spinocerebellum is going to take that last function, attending to the smoothness and the accuracy and the coordination of voluntary movements while they're in progress. So modulating the rate, range, and force of ongoing voluntary movements. We talked about rate, range, and force in the previous lecture. This word comparator is one that I talked a little bit about in the lecture hall. It's a word that's been used to describe what it is the spinocerebellum does, but over the years I discovered a lot of the people would say that and didn't really understand what it meant. All I mean to say by this is that the spinocerebellum receives information about what the planned motor behavior is. It also receives information about what is actually taking place, and it compares those two and adjusts movements as they're being initiated in upper motor neuron pathways so that the outcome matches better the plan. Now this is the same circuit as I showed you before, but I have rearranged this a little bit to suit me a little better. The input in this case is down here at the voluntary movement. So I'm going to actually get real fancy on you guys here. So this is the input. Okay, I'm going to confess I'm not entirely sure if I screwed up the recording on this. I guess you guys will be the judges. I don't want to back up now that I've gone 24 minutes into this. I'm talking about this circuit here. This is the simple circuit of afferent information going to a particular part of the cerebellum, coming back out and influencing upper motor neurons. The afferent information that the spinocerebellum in particular wants is unconscious proprioception. It is exactly the same information that's going into the PCML. It's just going to a different destination. So those same primary afferents are going to carry information up to the spinocerebellum as are carrying information up through the medial lemniscus and from there up to the thalamus, up to the cortex. All right, let's keep going here. I do apologize for the difficulty I had with that last set of slides. All right. The spinocerebellum has to influence voluntary motor systems. And when I say, what are these, I really want you to back off for a second and stop trying to guess what the right answer is and realize if I'm talking about voluntary movements, I'm talking about potentially all of these pathways, right? Because we have voluntary control not only via the lateral corticospinal tract and the lateral motor system, but also through those brainstem upper motor neuron pathways. We have voluntary control over those, and they create voluntary movements in the body. So we're going to have to ask the spinocerebellum to influence both medial and lateral motor systems. The lateral motor system, of course, is really pretty much confined to the lateral corticospinal tract. And for the medial, it's going to be a bunch of them, but we're going to concentrate on the two medial lateral vestibulospinal and the medial lateral reticulospinal tracts. We have voluntary control of those. They generate movement, and that movement is going to be regulated by the spinocerebellum so that what is taking place is more accurate. The lateral regions, the lateral motor systems, the lateral corticospinal tract, is influenced by paravermal regions, and therefore the paravermal regions are going to be associated with coordination in distal limb musculature. And the medial motor systems are influenced by the vermal regions of the spinocerebellum, and that's how we get spinocerebellar coordination influencing voluntary movement of axial muscles and proximal limb muscles. How convenient is it that the midline stuff, axial muscles, proximal limb muscles, is controlled by the midline portion of the cerebellum, the vermis. And we go lateral to that to find the parts of the spinocerebellum that influence more laterally placed muscles, in other words, distal limb musculature. So here's this circuit again. This is the same one you just saw a moment ago. And now I'm going to have to point out that we're going to ask the spinocerebellum to do two things. It's going to influence upper motor neurons that give rise to the lateral motor systems, and it's going to influence upper motor neurons that give rise to medial motor systems. This is the same diagram, just split out like that. Okay, I've got the vermis influencing the medial motor systems, giving rise to movement in the proximal muscles and the axial muscles. And I've got the paravermal regions now influencing the lateral motor systems, influencing the voluntary movement in the distal musculature. The information that comes back to the spinocerebellum, this unconscious proprioception, is going to arise via sensory pathways called spinocerebellar tracts. There's going to be a lab very shortly that's going to talk about these guys. I need to make a point about nomenclature here for just a second because it comes up every single year in spite of my best efforts, so listen up. When I say spinocerebellum, I am talking about a part of the cerebellum. When I say spinocerebellar tract, I'm talking about a bundle of white matter, that's what a tract is, that's going from the spinal cord up to the spinocerebellum. I find a lot of students will say spinocerebellar tract when they mean spinocerebellum, and that isn't right. That's not going to work for us. Spinocerebellum is part of the cerebellum. If you say spinocerebellar tract, you are talking about a white matter tract, and specifically one that comes up from the spinal cord and goes to the cerebellum. Please don't make that mistake. All right, let's consider each of these parts of the spinocerebellum separately. We're going to start with the axial stuff, the proximal limb stuff. We're talking about coordinating movement of muscles in the core, the trunk region, and in the proximal limbs. So neck, trunk, proximal limbs, they're all moving. They generate proprioception, and that proprioception is sent to the cortex of the vermis. The vermis is the part of the spinocerebellum that's concerned with axial muscles. That information arrives via all four of the spinocerebellar tracts I'm going to tell you about in the lab. The cortex of the vermis has to influence medial motor systems to influence neck, trunk, and proximal limb musculature. And we have to go out through one of the deep cerebellar nuclei. Now remember what I told you about the deep cerebellar nuclei and how they're arranged. The one that's most medial is concerned with movement on the midline, and that's the fastigial nucleus. So fastigial nucleus then gives rise to axons that come back out and influence the behavior of upper motor neuron pathways that they themselves will influence movement in the trunk and proximal limbs. That's, of course, the two vestibulospinal tracts and the two reticulospinal tracts. So the medial motor systems are the target of this part of the spinocerebellum. They produce movement in postural and anti-gravity muscles. We're talking about trunk muscles here in the proximal limb musculature. Movement ends up creating proximal limb and trunk information. This is seriously something of a closed loop in that information creates coordination instructions from the cerebellum, which influences movement in these anti-gravity, postural, trunk muscles, which creates information, which is then acted upon by the cerebellum, and so on and so forth. On the distal limbs, we're going to see the same circuit, right? There's going to be unconscious proprioception that influences part of the spinal cerebellum, comes out through one of the deep cerebellum nuclei, which then influences one of the upper motor neuron pathways, which gives rise to movement on distal limb musculature. So, as the distal limb information comes in, it goes to, in this case, the paravermal regions of the spinal cerebellum. And again, that information is arriving via all four of the spinocerebellar tracts. The output does not go through the fastigial nucleus, but neither does it go through the dentate. We finally have a role for the interposed nuclei. This was, remember, globose and emboliform, and I told you you can learn them as one, the interposed nuclei. These guys give rise to axons that then have to influence the behavior of the lateral corticospinal tract. And therefore, what we need to do is get that information on up to the cortex. And the red nucleus is involved to the extent that it gives rise to a pathway at all. It will be part of motor learning as well, and I'm not going to consider that particularly. The motor cortex, of course, gives rise to the lateral corticospinal tract, which produces activity in distal limbs. That creates information. That information is sent up to the cortex, and so on. The spinocerebellar tracts bring proprioception up to the spinocerebellum. And once again, when you say tract, you're not talking about the cerebellum, right? They have the same primary afferents as the PCML. There's no reason in the world to duplicate axons, duplicate primary afferents when we have perfectly good primary afferents bringing in information about proprioception. Those primary afferents branch in the posterior horn and synapse, giving rise to new tracts separate from the PCML that project to the cerebellum. This is proprioception in exactly the same way as it is in PCML, with the one critical distinction that PCML is taking that information to the cortex for conscious perception. The spinocerebellar tracts are taking it to the cerebellum, and therefore this is unconscious proprioception. There are four tracts that arise in the cord. The rostral spinocerebellar tract and the cuneo-cerebellar tracts are carrying information from the upper limb. The anterior spinocerebellar tract and the posterior spinocerebellar tract are carrying proprioceptive information from the lower limb. Now, what's left out of this description, of course, is that the trunk is also generating unconscious proprioception from the muscles in the trunk and the neck. And they're traveling in these pathways to the line that's drawn between the two, where do we transition from rostral and cuneo to anterior and posterior, is different in each of these tracks, and in the lab I'll diagram the ones that I think are important. Never forget, too, that there's proprioception coming from the head, and that is generated from, that is carried by the trigeminocerebellar tract. Cranial nerve 5, trigeminal nerve, is carrying most of the proprioception from the head, all of the proprioception from the head, and therefore from the trigeminal system in the brainstem, there's a projection that then is sent up to the cerebellum.